The Count of Ravenshire slammed the treasury door open and froze. 3 bags of royal gold were gone. The locks were untouched. The guards swore nobody had entered, and yet the missing key was found inside the room of a young maid named Elin. Before she could even defend herself, the Count ordered soldiers to seize her. Then another discovery made the situation worse. Royal gold was found hidden beneath the floor near her bed. Everything pointed directly at her. The Count believed he had caught the thief. But just as Elin was about to be taken away, royal horns thundered through the castle gates. King Edmund had arrived without warning. He carried a sealed wooden chest and immediately ordered the Count to stop the punishment. The king had evidence that the Count had never seen, and it would reveal why Elin had been framed in the first place. The winter of the 7th year of King Edmund's reign was remembered across Eldoria as one of the coldest winters in living memory. Snow covered the northern roads for weeks, making travel difficult and isolating many villages from the capital. Ravenshire Castle stood on a high hill above the frozen valley, surrounded by thick stone walls and 4 ancient towers. The castle belonged to Count Alaric Vane, a nobleman whose family had served the crown for generations. He was wealthy, respected, and powerful, but he was also extremely careful about his reputation. The king had recently entrusted Ravenshire with 12 heavy bags of royal gold because the northern roads were too dangerous for the treasure to continue toward the capital. The gold was temporarily stored inside the castle treasury until the royal convoy could travel safely. Every bag carried the royal seal, and every movement of the treasure was recorded by 2 officials. Nothing about the arrangement was supposed to be uncertain. On the night everything changed, a violent snowstorm struck Ravenshire. The wind shook the castle windows, the courtyard disappeared beneath white snow, and most of the household retired early. Only the guards, a few kitchen servants, and several senior officials remained awake. Count Alaric himself inspected the treasury shortly before midnight. He counted all 12 bags, checked the royal seals, and locked the door. He carried 1 treasury key. The second key belonged to his chief steward, Lord Victor Harrow. Victor had served the Vane family for 15 years and was considered one of the most trustworthy men in the castle. Shortly after midnight, the Count returned to his private chambers. He had no reason to believe that anything was wrong. At dawn, however, he was awakened by the steward. Victor reported that the treasury had been opened during the night. Count Alaric immediately followed him downstairs. When the treasury door opened, 11 bags were not missing. Only 3 had disappeared. The remaining 9 still stood exactly where they had been placed. There was no broken lock, no damaged door, and no sign that an outsider had entered. The Count's face became pale as he realized the seriousness of the situation. The stolen property belonged to the king. Whoever had taken it had not merely robbed a nobleman's treasury, they had stolen directly from the crown. Victor immediately called the guards and ordered the castle sealed. Every servant was questioned, every corridor was searched. Nobody was allowed to leave. Within an hour, suspicion fell upon a young maid named Elin. Elin had worked at Ravenshire since she was a child. She had arrived 4 years earlier after the death of the elderly woman who had raised her in a small northern village. She had no wealthy relatives, no important connections, and no protection at court. She cleaned the private corridors, prepared clothes for the senior household, and sometimes carried messages between the kitchen and the upper rooms. She was quiet and dependable. Because of her position, however, she was an easy target. The first piece of evidence appeared when the steward's treasury key was discovered inside Elin's wooden cleaning box. Victor claimed that the key had been locked inside his office the previous evening. He suggested that Elin must have stolen it while cleaning the room. The Count was troubled, But before he could investigate further, another discovery was made. 2 royal coin pouches were found beneath a loose floorboard near the servants' quarters. The pouches contained gold coins bearing the same royal seal as the missing treasure. The servants immediately became frightened. Elin was brought before the Count. She looked confused and terrified. She had no explanation for the key and no knowledge of the coin pouches. The Count ordered her room searched. Nothing valuable was found except an old silver pendant that Elin had worn since childhood. There was no hidden gold, no expensive clothing, and no evidence of sudden wealth. Yet Lord Victor insisted that the evidence was already overwhelming. He carefully explained that Elin had access to the Treasury corridor, had an opportunity to steal the key, and had been seen working near the western passage during the previous evening. The Count listened, but something did not feel right. 3 bags of gold were extremely heavy. Even a strong man would have struggled to move them through the castle without being noticed. Elin was a small young woman and could not reasonably have carried them alone. Victor answered that she might have received help. That explanation created another problem. No second suspect had been identified. The castle guards had watched the corridors throughout the night. They claimed nobody unusual had passed. Yet one guard remembered seeing a cloaked figure carrying a lantern near the western tower after midnight. The lantern carried the Count's household symbol, so the guard had assumed the person was one of the senior servants. This detail was recorded, but quickly dismissed. Count Alaric ordered the Treasury searched again. One guard noticed fresh scratches on the stone floor beneath a large wooden cabinet. The cabinet had stood against the wall for many years. When it was moved, the scratches became more obvious. There was evidence that something heavy had recently been dragged across the floor. Behind the cabinet was a section of stonework that looked older than the surrounding wall. It was the remains of an underground passage that had supposedly been sealed decades earlier. Victor immediately claimed that the passage was useless and could not possibly be connected to the theft. The Count remained uncertain. Ravenshire had been rebuilt several times after old wars, and many forgotten passages existed beneath its foundations. Before he could order a full investigation, a messenger arrived from the northern road. The message came from the capital. King Edmund had learned about the missing gold. The king had not waited for the Count's official report. A secret royal courier had reached the palace during the night and delivered information that had clearly frightened the royal court. Count Alaric expected investigators to arrive within several days. Instead, the king himself decided to travel to Ravenshire. By sunrise, the royal carriage was already moving through the snow. At Ravenshire, Elin was locked in a guard room beneath the eastern tower. She believed that her life had ended. She had no family powerful enough to defend her, and no understanding of why someone would accuse her of stealing royal gold. While she sat alone, Lord Victor quietly entered the Count's private office. He closed the door and removed a small folded document from his coat. He believed nobody had seen him, but an old servant named Bram had noticed him leaving the room. Bram had served Ravenshire for more than 30 years and understood the castle better than almost anyone. He also remembered something else. The white sealing powder found on one of the stolen coin pouches was identical to the powder used inside the Count's private archive. A poor maid would never have had access to it. Bram realized the evidence against Elin might have been deliberately prepared. Before he could tell the Count, however, the royal horns sounded from the courtyard. King Edmund had arrived. He stepped from the carriage carrying a small wooden chest sealed with the royal crest. He looked toward the castle, then toward the guard room where Elin was being held. He had not traveled through the snow merely because 3 bags of gold had disappeared. The secret report he had received contained another name. It was the name of a child who had vanished 7 years earlier. That name was connected to the pendant around Elin's neck. King Edmund entered the great hall shortly after sunrise. His arrival immediately changed the atmosphere inside Ravenshire. The Count bowed deeply while the servants stood silently along the walls. Royal guards positioned themselves beside every entrance. Nobody was permitted to leave the castle. The king carried the sealed wooden chest himself. It was old, dark, and covered with marks from years of storage. The royal seal on its lid had never been broken. Count Alaric expected the king to demand an explanation for the missing gold. Instead, the king first ordered Elin brought from the guard room. The maid entered the hall wearing the same simple dress she'd worn during her arrest. She looked exhausted, but remained calm. The king studied her carefully before looking at the silver pendant around her neck. His expression changed for only a moment, but the count noticed it. The pendant was small and plain. It had belonged to Elin for as long as she could remember. She had been told that it was the only thing left to her from her mother. The king did not touch it. He simply asked the royal guards to examine its markings. On the back of the pendant was a tiny symbol shaped like a crown surrounded by 3 leaves. Almost nobody in Eldoria recognized it. The symbol had once belonged to the private household of Queen Seraphine, who had died several years earlier. The king ordered the treasury evidence placed on a large table. The key, the coin pouches, the records, and the reports were arranged in front of him. He examined everything without speaking. Then he began reconstructing the timeline. The steward claimed that his key had been stolen before midnight. Yet the castle records showed that Victor had entered his office after midnight. If the key had already been stolen, he should have noticed its absence earlier. More importantly, the key found inside Elin's cleaning box had traces of oil that were not present on the original key. It had been copied. The king's investigators had compared the shape of the teeth with the treasury lock and discovered that it was a duplicate. The original key had never left Victor's possession. The evidence immediately weakened the accusation. The king then examined the coin pouches. Their royal seals were authentic, but the pouches had been placed beneath the floorboard after the servants' quarters had already been cleaned. Dust around the floorboard showed that the pouches had been inserted recently. The person who planted them had deliberately chosen a location close to Elin's room. The king ordered the guards to search the western corridor again. They found several footprints beneath the fresh snow. Most belonged to guards. One set belonged to a person wearing iron-soled boots. The boots were unusually large and heavy. The tracks led from the western tower to the treasury passage. Lord Victor wore precisely that type of boot. Victor attempted to explain the tracks by claiming that he had inspected the courtyard earlier. The king rejected the explanation because fresh snow had fallen after midnight, and the footprints contained fresh snow along their edges. They had been made during the period when Victor claimed to have been asleep. The king then ordered the old underground passage examined. The royal guards removed several stones and discovered that the passage had not been completely sealed. It led from the western tower to a storage room beneath the treasury. The room contained old crates, but some of them had been moved recently. Fresh marks appeared on the floor. The 3 missing bags could easily have been transported through the passage without anyone seeing them. The count was stunned. He realized that the thief had not needed to enter through the main treasury corridor at all. Someone with knowledge of the old castle plans could have used the hidden route. Victor had served in Ravenshire long enough to know every forgotten passage. The king returned to the great hall and finally broke the seal on the wooden chest. Inside were documents collected over many years by the royal archivists. The first document was an old financial record from 7 years earlier. It showed that several shipments of royal silver had been sent to Ravenshire but never reached the capital. The official explanation claimed that bandits had attacked the convoy. The king placed another document beside it. It showed that the silver had been moved into Ravenshire's storage system before the supposed attack. The records had been altered afterward. The signature authorizing the altered records belonged to Victor. The count stared at the document in disbelief. Victor had been managing the castle's finances during that entire period. The king revealed that he had suspected Victor for years, but suspicion alone was not enough to accuse a powerful noble servant. The missing gold had finally created the opportunity to expose him. The king's investigators had recently discovered an old merchant ledger containing secret payments connected to the stolen silver. Several merchants had paid money to officials who helped disguise the theft. The payments eventually led back to Ravenshire. The same network appeared to be operating again. The 3 bags of gold were not simply stolen. They were being moved through the same secret route used years earlier. Elin had been selected as the scapegoat because her social position made her easy to blame. Yet the king's discovery of her pendant introduced another mystery. 7 years earlier, the royal family had suffered a tragedy. A royal carriage carrying a newborn child had been attacked while traveling toward a northern estate. The child disappeared. The nurse responsible for protecting the baby was later reported dead. The royal court announced that the child had probably died during the attack. King Edmund never believed the official explanation. He had searched quietly for 7 years. The child had been his daughter. Queen Seraphine had given birth to a girl shortly before the attack, and the baby had been wearing a silver pendant marked with the royal family symbol. The pendant around Elin's neck matched the description exactly. The king ordered the old royal records brought from the chest. One record contained a description of the missing child's birthmarks. Another described the pendant. A third mentioned a small scar on the infant's wrist. The king looked at Elin's wrist. The scar was there. Elin had never known why she had it. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. She had not stolen the royal gold. She might actually be the missing princess. But the king did not reveal her identity immediately. He knew that someone in Ravenshire had tried to destroy evidence of her existence. If the conspirators discovered that the king had found the lost princess, they might flee before the entire network could be exposed. The king therefore ordered everyone to remain silent about the pendant. He instructed his guards to protect Elin without explaining why. Victor remained under observation but was not yet arrested. The king wanted him to believe that the accusation against Elin was still alive. The plan worked. Victor relaxed slightly. He believed the maid would soon be punished and that the investigation would end with her. He did not realize that the king had already discovered the hidden passage, the duplicate key, and the old financial records. Most importantly, he did not know that the wooden chest contained a letter written 7 years earlier by the royal nurse. That letter could identify the person who had ordered the attack on the royal carriage. And that person was not Victor. The king's investigation continued through the afternoon. Ravenshire Castle became a place of quiet tension as royal guards searched every archive, office, storage room, and private chamber. Count Alaric remained beside the king throughout the process. His confidence in Victor had collapsed. For years, the steward had controlled the castle's finances, organized supplies, prepared official reports, and managed correspondence with the crown. Count Alaric now realized that he had allowed one man to hold too much power. Every document Victor had prepared needed to be examined. Every payment required verification. Every old report needed to be compared with the royal archives. The king ordered the castle records separated into 2 groups. One contained genuine documents. The other contained records that showed signs of alteration. The second group was surprisingly large. Several pages had been replaced, dates had been changed, and signatures had been copied. The pattern revealed that the corruption was not recent. It had existed for years. The missing gold was simply the newest operation. The king's investigators returned from the hidden chamber carrying the 3 stolen bags. They had found more than gold. Behind a false wall were 6 wooden boxes filled with merchant contracts, coded letters, and payment records. The documents showed that royal silver had been sold secretly to foreign traders 7 years earlier. The profits had been divided among several people. Victor had received a portion, but another name appeared repeatedly. Lord Merrick Vale, a senior royal official responsible for northern military supplies. Merrick had visited Ravenshire many times. He had always claimed to be inspecting the kingdom's defenses. In reality, he had been supervising the secret trade. The king immediately understood why the old investigation had failed. The person responsible for investigating the missing silver had been one of the people benefiting from its disappearance. The king then opened the final compartment of the wooden chest. Inside was a bundle wrapped in blue cloth. It contained a letter from the royal nurse who had disappeared 7 years earlier. The letter had been discovered only recently in a monastery archive. The nurse explained that the royal carriage attack had not been a random robbery. The attackers had known exactly where the baby was sitting. They had been paid to capture the child alive. The nurse escaped with the baby and fled north. She eventually reached a small village where she found a widow willing to protect the child. The nurse gave the widow the silver pendant and instructed her never to reveal the child's identity unless the king himself came searching. The nurse then continued traveling to draw the attackers away. She never returned. The letter ended with a warning that the people behind the attack were powerful enough to reach the royal court. The king knew immediately that Elin was the child described in the letter. The widow's village was only a day's journey from the place where Elin had been found 7 years earlier. The dates matched, the pendant matched, the scar matched, the age matched. The king finally allowed himself to believe what he had feared to hope for. His daughter had survived. Yet before announcing the truth, he needed to understand how Victor had discovered Elin's existence. The answer came from an old castle record. 7 years earlier, Victor had been responsible for transporting supplies through the northern region. His records showed a mysterious payment to a local merchant near the village where the royal child had been hidden. The payment occurred only weeks after the carriage attack. Victor had been searching for the child. He had failed to find her because the widow had kept her hidden. Years later, Victor discovered that the girl had entered Ravenshire as a servant. He recognized the pendant and realized that the missing princess was living under his own roof. That explained the accusation. Victor had not simply wanted to steal the gold. He wanted to remove Elin before the royal investigation could uncover her identity. The stolen gold gave him the perfect excuse. If she were condemned for theft, nobody would listen to her claims about Victor. The king now understood the entire plan. The Count's treasury had been used to store royal property. Victor secretly moved the gold through the old passage. He planted a duplicate key in Elin's cleaning box. He placed 2 coin pouches near her room. He falsified the timeline and prepared witnesses who would claim she had been near the treasury. Then he intended to report the crime to the crown and demand severe punishment. The king realized that if he had arrived 2 days later, Elin might have been permanently removed from Ravenshire before anyone examined the evidence carefully. The king ordered Victor arrested. Royal guards entered the steward's office and found him standing beside his desk. His private drawers contained copies of several royal seals and a list of payments to guards. The discovery was enough to confirm his involvement. Victor was taken into custody. The Count looked at Elin with shame. He had believed the accusation because the evidence appeared convincing. He now understood how easily a respected noble could be manipulated by carefully planted evidence. Elin herself remained overwhelmed. The king approached her and finally revealed the truth. She was the missing daughter of King Edmund and Queen Seraphine. She had been taken away from the royal family as an infant and raised far from the palace. Elin could hardly process the information. Her entire identity had changed in a single afternoon. She was no longer merely a maid accused of theft. She was a princess who had been missing for 7 years. Yet the king did not force her to immediately accept the royal title. He understood that discovering one's true identity could be frightening. He allowed her time. He also promised that the woman who had raised her would be brought safely to the palace. Elin's greatest fear was not becoming a princess. It was losing the only family she had ever known. The king promised that nobody would take that family away. Before the evening ended, another document was discovered inside Victor's office. It contained instructions for a secret meeting at an abandoned chapel beyond the Western Road. The meeting was scheduled for the following night. Several names appeared in the document, including Lord Merrick. The king realized that Victor was only one piece of the conspiracy. If the other conspirators learned that Victor had been captured, they would destroy the remaining evidence and flee. The king therefore decided to let the meeting happen. Victor would be kept alive and secretly transported toward the chapel under heavy guard. The royal soldiers would follow from a distance. The king expected to catch the remaining conspirators together. He believed the plan was secure, but someone inside Ravenshire had already discovered that the king knew about the chapel. Before midnight, a secret message left the castle through the kitchen entrance. The conspirators had been warned. The king had found the lost princess, the gold had been recovered, and their entire operation was in danger. The secret message reached Lord Merrick before midnight. He was waiting at a remote hunting lodge several miles from Ravenshire, surrounded by men loyal to him. The message contained enough information to make him understand the danger. Victor had been captured. The missing gold had been recovered. The king had discovered the hidden passage. Most alarming of all, the lost royal child had been found alive. Merrick knew that the discovery of Elin's identity could destroy everything. 7 years earlier, he had helped arrange the attack on the royal carriage, because he believed the royal child could later be used as a political weapon. The plan had failed when the nurse escaped. Merrick had then spent years searching for the child. He had eventually assumed she had died. Now she had appeared in Ravenshire as a maid. The theft of the royal gold had been his final opportunity to eliminate her. He had encouraged Victor to accuse her and had promised to arrange her punishment through corrupt officials. The arrival of King Edmund had ruined the plan. Merrick immediately changed his strategy. He ordered his remaining followers to abandon the chapel meeting and destroy the records hidden in several merchant warehouses. Meanwhile, inside Ravenshire, the king began searching for the person who had sent the warning. The message had left through the kitchen. The kitchen servants were questioned separately. Most knew nothing. One young stable boy remembered seeing a senior housekeeper carrying a sealed envelope toward the courtyard. The housekeeper was brought before the royal guards. She eventually admitted that she had delivered the message, but claimed that she had not known its contents. She had been told that the envelope contained a medical order for a merchant. The king believed her. He realized the conspirators had used ordinary servants without revealing the true nature of the operation. This made the search more difficult. The king then ordered the castle gates closed completely. Nobody could leave without inspection. Elin remained under royal protection in a private chamber. Count Alaric stayed nearby. He had become deeply ashamed of how quickly he had believed the accusation against her. He had not personally mistreated Elin, but he had allowed Victor's evidence to influence his judgment. He now understood that his responsibility as a ruler was not simply to protect his property. It was to protect people under his authority from false accusations. The king accepted his cooperation and asked him to help identify every person who had worked with Victor. Count Alaric began reviewing years of household records. He discovered unusual payments to guards who had later left Ravenshire. He found shipments of empty crates sent toward the northern border. He found letters from Merrick disguised as ordinary military reports. The pattern was unmistakable. Victor had been the local organizer. Merrick had been the political protector. Several merchants had handled the stolen goods. Some guards had protected the secret routes. The network had been larger than anyone had imagined. At dawn, royal soldiers arrived from the capital with additional orders. Lord Merrick had been located. He had attempted to flee north, but was captured near a frozen river. His carriage contained several sealed documents. One document was a letter written 7 years earlier. It contained instructions to the men who attacked the royal carriage. The order clearly stated that the child must be taken alive. Another document revealed that Merrick had received money from the same merchants connected to the stolen royal silver. The evidence finally connected the old crime with the new theft. The king ordered Merrick brought to Ravenshire. When he arrived, he was placed under guard beside Victor. The two men could no longer hide behind their titles. The king ordered their records compared. Every payment, every shipment, and every secret letter was connected. The theft of the gold was no longer a mystery. It was the final operation in a conspiracy that had lasted 7 years. Yet, the king still wanted to understand why Elin had been targeted so urgently. Merrick's captured letters provided the answer. One letter mentioned that a royal archivist had recently discovered documents proving that the child might have survived. Merrick had learned about the discovery and feared that the king would restart the search. He therefore ordered Victor to locate the girl before the royal investigators arrived. Victor discovered that Elin wore the same pendant described in the old records. He recognized the symbol immediately. He then informed Merrick. Together, they created the theft. The stolen gold was chosen because it belonged to the crown and because a crime involving royal property would create enormous pressure on the count to find someone quickly. Elin was perfect because nobody in the castle would expect a maid to have powerful enemies. The plan would have succeeded if the king had not arrived personally. After reading the documents, the king realized that Elin's life had been in danger for much longer than anyone knew. He ordered a permanent royal guard assigned to her until the remaining conspirators were identified. He also sent a royal escort to retrieve the widow who had raised her. That woman arrived 2 days later. She was old, frightened, and confused by the sight of the royal guards outside her cottage. When she entered Ravenshire and saw Elin, the two embraced silently. The king watched from a distance. He understood that blood alone did not define a family. The woman had raised his daughter when he could not. She had protected her without knowing whether anyone would ever reward her. The king therefore granted the widow a place in the royal household and enough land to live comfortably for the rest of her life. Elin was relieved. She would not have to choose between her past and her new identity. She could keep both. The final stage of the investigation took several weeks. Merchants were arrested, records were recovered, and hidden stores of stolen royal property were found. The crown eventually recovered nearly everything taken during the previous 7 years. The kingdom learned that the conspiracy had survived because powerful people had trusted appearances. Victor looked loyal. Merrick looked honorable. Their documents looked official. Their accusations looked reasonable. Yet the truth had survived in tiny details. A pendant, a footprint, a duplicate key, a dusty floorboard, a forgotten letter, and a maid who had been too poor for anyone to believe she could possibly matter. When the investigation was finally complete, the king prepared to return to the capital. Before leaving Ravenshire, he made one final announcement. Elin would be recognized publicly as Princess Eliana, but she would not be forced to abandon the name she had grown up with. She would remain connected to the people who had known her before the crown. The decision surprised the court, but the king believed it was right. A princess who remembered ordinary life could understand the kingdom better than one who had never left the palace. The royal procession left Ravenshire at the beginning of spring. The roads were still wet from melting snow, but the worst of winter had passed. Elin traveled in the royal carriage beside the king, yet she did not feel like a princess. She still felt like the same young woman who had spent years cleaning rooms, carrying linens, and eating meals with the household servants. The king understood that the change in title would take time. He did not ask her to behave differently immediately. Instead, he showed her the palace gradually. He introduced her to the royal gardens, the old library, the council chamber, and the private rooms that had once belonged to Queen Seraphine. The queen's chambers had remained almost untouched since her death. The king had preserved them because he had never accepted that his family had truly disappeared. In one room stood a small wooden cradle. Beside it was a portrait of Queen Seraphine holding her newborn daughter. Elin stared at the portrait for a long time. The woman in the painting wore the same silver pendant. For the first time, Elin understood that the object she had carried all her life had once belonged to a mother who had loved her before she could remember love. The king then showed her the royal records from the night she disappeared. The records contained reports from soldiers, nurses, merchants, and villagers. Some were accurate. Others had been altered by Merrick. The king explained that he had spent 7 years searching quietly because he believed someone inside the court was involved. He had feared that a public search would warn the conspirators. Every false lead had cost him hope, yet he had never stopped looking. Elin finally understood why the king had reacted so strongly when he saw the pendant in Ravenshire. It was not merely a royal symbol. It was the last physical evidence that his daughter might still be alive. The official royal announcement came several weeks later. The kingdom learned that the missing princess had survived. People across Eldoria were surprised. Some remembered the old tragedy. Others had never known the truth. The announcement also revealed that the Count of Ravenshire had been deceived by a criminal network operating inside his household. The royal gold had been recovered, and the maid who had been accused had been completely cleared. The story quickly spread beyond the kingdom. Many people admired Elin because she had endured humiliation without becoming cruel. She had been accused of a crime she did not commit, yet she did not seek revenge against every person who had doubted her. She understood that some had been deceived just as she had been. Count Alaric personally apologized to her. He admitted that he had judged too quickly. Elin accepted his apology. She did not forget what had happened, but she understood that admitting a mistake required courage. The Count also changed the rules of Ravenshire. No servant could again be accused of a serious crime without independent evidence. Every accusation involving royal property required a royal investigation. Financial records were reviewed by several officials instead of one steward. The hidden passage beneath the Treasury was permanently sealed and documented in the castle archives. Bram, the old servant who had noticed the strange white powder, was given a permanent position as keeper of the archives. He had never expected recognition. He had simply noticed something that did not make sense. Elin often visited him when she returned to Ravenshire. She believed he had helped save her life. Victor and Merrick were tried under royal law. The trial lasted several weeks because their crimes involved years of stolen property and false records. The evidence was overwhelming. The duplicate key proved Victor had planned the theft. The hidden gold proved he had moved the royal property. The financial ledgers connected him to the merchants. Merrick's letters connected him to the attack on the royal carriage and the disappearance of the princess. Both men were stripped of their positions and wealth. Their associates were punished according to their individual roles. The king refused to punish innocent family members simply because they carried the same surname. Justice was based on actions, not blood. The recovered gold was returned to the royal treasury. Some of it was used to repair villages that had suffered during years of corruption. The king also created a new system to protect workers in noble households. Servants could report crimes directly to royal officials without going through their employers. Elin had inspired the reform because her case showed how dangerous it could be when a powerless person depended entirely on the people who controlled her. As months passed, Elin began to adapt to royal life. She learned history, law, diplomacy, and the responsibilities of governing. She was not naturally interested in ceremony. She preferred visiting villages and speaking with ordinary people. The king encouraged her. He believed that her years as a maid had given her something no royal tutor could teach. She knew what it felt like to be ignored. She knew what it meant to have no one believe your explanation. She understood how small injustices could become large tragedies when nobody listened. Her first official journey took her through the northern provinces. She visited Ravenshire, the villages around it, and the monastery where the royal nurse's letter had been found. At each place, people recognized her story. Some had heard exaggerated versions of the theft. Others knew only that a maid had been accused of stealing royal gold. Elin never allowed the story to become a legend about herself. She always explained that the truth had been discovered because many people contributed small pieces of evidence. The old servant had noticed the powder, a guard had remembered the footprints, a royal archivist had found the hidden ledger. The widow had protected the child. The nurse had written the letter. The king had followed the evidence instead of the accusation. No single person had solved the mystery alone. Elin eventually returned to the village where she had grown up. The small house where she had lived was still standing. The garden was older and wilder than she remembered. She walked through it with the woman who had raised her. The royal guards waited at a respectful distance. Elin realized that she did not have to choose between being Princess Eliana and being the girl who had once lived there. Both were part of her. The king later granted the village new protection and repaired the road connecting it to the nearest town. The widow received a comfortable home near the palace, but continued visiting the village. Elin visited her often. The family that had been separated by conspiracy was slowly becoming a family again. One evening, the king gave Elin the wooden chest that had contained the evidence. It was no longer sealed. Inside were copies of the nurse's letter, the old royal records, and the first report about the missing child. He wanted her to keep them because they belonged to her history. Elin placed the silver pendant beside them. The object that had once been used as evidence of a lost identity now represented her return home. She realized that the accusation in Ravenshire had nearly destroyed her, but it had also brought the hidden truth into the light. The stolen gold had exposed the thieves. The false accusation had exposed the conspiracy. The king's arrival had exposed the evidence, and the evidence had restored a daughter to her father. Several years passed after the events at Ravenshire. Eldoria became a more stable kingdom. The old smuggling network disappeared, and the northern provinces grew safer. Royal finances were reorganized, noble estates were inspected more carefully, and officials could no longer hide behind titles when evidence showed wrongdoing. The story of the Ravenshire gold became famous throughout the kingdom, but the king preferred that people remember the lesson rather than the scandal. He often reminded officials that an accusation was not proof and that social position was not evidence of innocence or guilt. Princess Eliana eventually became one of the most respected members of the royal family. She did not become famous because of her birth. She became respected because of what she did with the life she had recovered. Her experience as a servant gave her a different understanding of the kingdom. She noticed problems that wealthy nobles rarely saw. She noticed villages without proper roads, workers who could not report abusive employers, and families who struggled because local officials demanded unfair payments. She worked with the royal council to create new protections for ordinary citizens. Her proposals were sometimes criticized by nobles who believed she was too sympathetic to common people. She never changed her position. She knew what it felt like to stand in a great hall while powerful people decided her fate without listening. She wanted no one else to experience that helplessness. King Edmund supported her work. Their relationship had grown slowly. The king had lost 7 years with his daughter, but he did not try to force those years back into existence. Instead, he built new memories with her. They traveled through the kingdom together. They visited villages, reviewed public works, and sometimes returned to Ravenshire. Count Alaric remained the lord of the castle, but had changed greatly. He no longer allowed one steward to control every record. His household became more open, and servants were treated with greater respect. He kept a copy of the investigation in the castle archive. Visitors could read the records and learn how the theft had been uncovered. The hidden passage beneath the treasury remained sealed. Above it, a simple stone marker was placed to remind future generations that secrets hidden in darkness eventually came into the light. Bram continued working in the archive until his final years. He took great pride in the fact that one small observation had helped change the course of the investigation. Whenever young servants asked how he had known something was wrong, he explained that he had simply paid attention. He never claimed to be a hero. Elin believed that was precisely why his contribution mattered. Heroes were often imagined as powerful people who performed extraordinary acts. Bram had done something much simpler. He noticed a detail others ignored. The old widow who had raised Elin also became part of the royal household. She never became comfortable with palace ceremonies, but nobody expected her to. She preferred the palace gardens and quiet rooms. Elin often visited her there. They spoke about the village, the small house, and the years before the truth was discovered. Elin never called those years wasted. They had shaped her into the person she became. The memory of being accused also remained with her. She did not think of it every day, but she never forgot the moment when the Count had looked at her as if she were a criminal. That memory helped her understand why justice needed patience. Evidence could be manufactured, witnesses could lie, documents could be changed, people could be frightened into silence. The truth sometimes required time. Years after the theft, Elin returned to the great hall of Ravenshire alone. She stood where she had once been accused. The room looked smaller than she remembered. The walls were the same. The windows were the same. But she was no longer the frightened maid who had stood there waiting for punishment. She was now a princess, a royal advisor, and someone trusted by thousands of people. Yet she did not feel superior to the person she had once been. She felt grateful for that girl. The girl had survived without knowing who she was. She had worked honestly even when life was difficult. She had remained kind despite being powerless. Those qualities had mattered more than her royal blood. Count Alaric joined her in the hall. He had grown older and quieter. He told her that the castle had changed since the investigation. Servants were treated differently. Records were checked carefully. No accusation was accepted without proof. The Count had spent years trying to become the kind of ruler he should have been from the beginning. Elin forgave him completely. She understood that forgiveness did not mean pretending the past had not happened. It meant refusing to allow the past to control the future. Before leaving Ravenshire, Elin entered the old Treasury. The 3 missing bags of gold had been returned years earlier. The walls had been repaired, and the hidden passage was sealed. On a shelf stood a copy of the original royal ledger. Beside it was a small plaque describing the case. Elin read the final line. It explained that the investigation had exposed a conspiracy that had remained hidden for 7 years and had restored the lost daughter of the king to her family. She smiled because the line did not mention that she had once been a maid. She did not need it to. She knew who she had been, and she knew who she had become. When she returned to the capital, the king was waiting in the palace garden. The sun was setting behind the towers. He handed her the old silver pendant. It had been cleaned and carefully repaired. The tiny royal symbol still remained on its back. The king had once feared that the pendant would be the last trace of his missing daughter. Now it was a reminder that she had come home. Elin placed it around her neck. She did not need a grand ceremony. She did not need a crowd. The truth itself was enough. The stolen gold had been recovered. The innocent maid had been cleared. The corrupt steward had been exposed. The hidden conspiracy had fallen apart. The lost princess had returned to her family, and the kingdom had learned that the most convincing evidence could sometimes be a carefully constructed lie. The real evidence was often quieter. It could be hidden in a forgotten record, an old footprint, a copied key, a tiny mark on silver, or the memory of someone who refused to ignore what seemed wrong. Elin carried that lesson throughout the rest of her life. She became known not as the princess who had once been accused of stealing gold, but as the princess who insisted that every person deserved to be heard before being judged. Her story was told to children, servants, soldiers, nobles, and future rulers. The message remained simple. Power could create fear, but it could not create truth. Wealth could buy silence, but it could not erase evidence. A noble title could hide a criminal for years, but eventually the smallest mistake could reveal everything. And sometimes the person standing alone beneath an accusation was not the weakest person in the room. Sometimes that person carried the truth that everyone else had failed to see. On the night the royal gold disappeared, Elin had believed she was losing everything. She had not known that the accusation would lead the king to the secret of her birth. She had not known that the wooden chest carried evidence of a 7-year search. She had not known that the people trying to destroy her would accidentally reveal the truth that would restore her place in the kingdom. But that was how the mystery of Ravenshire ended. The Count's gold returned to the crown. The stolen records returned to the royal archive. The conspirators received justice. The widow who had protected a child was given a safe home. The king found the daughter he had never stopped searching for. And Elin, who had once stood in the great hall as a frightened maid, eventually stood there again as Princess Eliana. Not because a crown had changed who she was, but because the truth had finally revealed who she had always been. The kingdom moved forward, and the old accusation became a story of justice rather than shame. The final lesson remained carved into the archive of Ravenshire for generations. Never judge the person standing beneath the accusation until you have discovered who placed the evidence there. Because sometimes the thief is not the person holding the gold. Sometimes the real thief is the person controlling the story, and sometimes, hidden behind the accusation, is a truth powerful enough to change an entire kingdom.